I am Emma, 28 years old, and today in family court, I watched my stepmother Diane's confident smirk completely vanish when I handed the judge a manila envelope. The judge's eyebrows shot up as he examined the contents, then looked directly at Diane and asked, "Mrs. Harrison, are you aware of what your stepdaughter has discovered?" Diane's face drained of all color as she whispered, What is that?" Before I tell you exactly what was in that envelope and how it destroyed her in court, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit that like button if you've ever had a step-parent betray your trust. And subscribe, because this story of how I got the ultimate revenge on the woman who stole my inheritance will show you that justice sometimes takes 10 years, but it always comes. 10 years ago, when I was 18 and fresh out of high school, I thought I had my whole life figured out. My father, Robert, had passed away 6 months earlier from cancer, leaving me devastated but financially secure with a substantial inheritance he had carefully planned for my future. The will was clear. The family home, his business investments, and a trust fund worth over $400,000 were all mine when I turned 21. Until then, my stepmother Diane would serve as trustee, managing the assets for my benefit and education. Diane had married my father when I was 15, 3 years after my mother died in a car accident. She was 32 then, beautiful, charming, and everything my grieving father thought he needed. She had a daughter from her previous marriage, Ashley, who was 2 years younger than me. And suddenly, our quiet house became filled with their belongings, their traditions, and their way of doing things. At first, I tried to be welcoming. My father seemed happier than he had been since Mom's death, and I wanted him to be okay. Diane was sweet to me in those early days, buying me clothes, taking me shopping, and including me in activities with Ashley. She called me her bonus daughter and talked about how we would be a real family. But things changed after the wedding. Small things at first. My mother's photos mysteriously disappeared from the living room, replaced with new family portraits that somehow always seemed to feature Diane prominently when I was positioned at the edge. Family dinners shifted to accommodate Ashley's preferences, and suddenly the traditions my mother and I had shared, like our Sunday morning pancakes and weekly art museum visits, were deemed too time-consuming for our new family schedule. When my father got sick during my senior year, Diane stepped into the role of primary caregiver with an efficiency that seemed almost eager. She managed his medications, his doctor appointments, and gradually, his business affairs. She convinced him that he was too stressed to handle his investment portfolio and that she should take over temporarily to ease his burden. I was so focused on my dying father and my upcoming graduation that I didn't pay enough attention to these changes. I spent every free moment at his bedside, holding his hand, reading to him, and listening to his stories about Mom. In those final weeks, he would often drift off while talking, and Diane would quietly suggest I go home and rest while she handled the difficult stuff. The funeral was a blur of flowers, casseroles, and relatives I hadn't seen in years. Everyone commented on how strong and organized Diane was, how lucky my father had been to have someone so capable taking care of everything. Ashley cried dramatically throughout the service, while I sat in numb silence, feeling like I was watching my father's funeral from outside my own body. 2 weeks after the funeral, when the immediate chaos had settled and relatives had returned to their own lives, Diane called me into the kitchen for what she called an important conversation about our future. She sat across from me at the table where my father and I had shared so many breakfasts, her hands folded, her expression more serious than I had ever seen it. "Emma, we need to discuss some changes," she began, her voice taking on a tone I had never heard before. "This house is expensive to maintain, and with your father gone, we need to be practical about our situation." I nodded, assuming she was talking about budgeting or maybe selling some of Dad's collectibles. I had no idea what was coming. I've been reviewing the finances, and frankly, there isn't as much money as your father led you to believe, she continued. The medical bills were enormous, and the business has been struggling for longer than he told anyone. The inheritance you're expecting, well, it's complicated. My stomach dropped. What do you mean complicated? The trust fund had to be used for your father's care, she said, not meeting my eyes. The medical expenses, the experimental treatments he wanted to try, the home nursing care in those final months, it all came from your inheritance. I tried to stop him, but he insisted that his health was more important than money. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. But the house, the business investments, the house has a reverse mortgage your father took out last year. We owe more than it's worth. The business investments, she sighed dramatically. I'm sorry, Emma, but there's nothing left. In fact, there are debts that need to be paid. The room seemed to spin around me. My father had been so careful about planning for my future, so proud of the legacy he was leaving me. He had talked about it constantly during his illness, making me promise to use the money wisely, to go to college, to build a good life. I don't understand, I whispered. Dad showed me the bank statements, the investment portfolio. Those are from before he got sick, Diane said, her voice taking on what she probably thought was a compassionate tone. Emma, I know this is devastating, but we have to face reality. There's no money for college, and honestly, we can't afford to maintain this house with just my income. She leaned forward, reaching across the table as if to comfort me. I've been thinking about what's best for everyone, and I believe you should consider getting your own place. You're 18 now, an adult. It's time for you to start making your own way in the world. Ashley is still in school, still my responsibility, but you're old enough to be independent. The words hit me like physical blows. She was kicking me out. 2 weeks after my father's funeral, the woman he had married was kicking me out of my childhood home with nothing. Where am I supposed to go? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. You're resourceful, she said, already standing up as if the conversation was over. You'll figure it out. There are apartments you can afford if you get a job, maybe some roommates. It'll be good for you, learning to stand on your own feet. I sat there in stunned silence as she bustled around the kitchen, already moving on to other things as if she hadn't just destroyed my entire future with a 5-minute conversation. That night, I called my father's lawyer, Mr. Peterson, the man who had helped draft the will. I explained what Diane had told me, expecting him to clarify the situation, to assure me that there had been some misunderstanding. I'm sorry, Emma. I advised your father against some of the financial decisions he made during his illness, but he was adamant. The medical expenses were significant, and he chose to use the trust fund assets rather than burden you with debt after his death. But surely there's something left, I pressed. The house, the business investments. The house does have a reverse mortgage your father took out last year. We owe more than it's worth. The business investments? She sighed dramatically. I'm sorry, Emma, but there's nothing left. In fact, there are debts that need to be paid. I hung up feeling more confused and desperate than ever. I had gone from thinking I was inheriting enough money to pay for college and start my adult life to learning that I was essentially homeless with no resources. The next morning, Diane was all business. She had already contacted a realtor about selling the house and had looked up apartment listings for me. She handed me a printout of cheap studios and one-bedroom places, none of which I could afford without a full-time job. Next month, I repeated, my voice cracking. You want me gone in a month? Emma, the sooner you start your independent life, the better, she said firmly. I've been more than generous letting you stay here rent-free for 2 weeks after the funeral. Ashley needs stability right now, and frankly, having you here is a constant reminder of loss for us." Ashley, who had been eating cereal at the counter, looked up with what I can only describe as smug satisfaction. "Maybe now I can finally have the bigger bedroom," she said casually. I stared at her, realizing that this had all been planned. They had discussed this, plotted it, decided on my future without involving me at all. That afternoon, I packed my belongings into garbage bags and boxes, taking only what could fit in my small car. Diane watched from the doorway as I loaded everything, offering no help and no emotion. "This is for the best," she said as I closed my trunk. "You'll see, sometimes we have to be forced out of our comfort zones to really grow." I drove away from the house where I had lived since I was 5 years old, where my mother had sung me lullabies and my father had taught me to ride a bike. I had nowhere to go and barely enough money in my checking account to survive for more than a few weeks. I ended up at a cheap motel, paying by the week while I frantically applied for jobs and tried to figure out my next steps. The applications Diane had given me led to interviews at retail stores where managers took one look at my lack of experience and obvious desperation and offered me minimum wage positions with unpredictable schedules. The reality of my situation hit me fully during those first weeks. I was 18, alone, with no family support, no college fund, and no safety net. Every decision my father had made to protect my future had somehow been twisted into leaving me with nothing. But even in those darkest moments, something didn't feel right about Diane's story. My father had been a careful, methodical man who had spent years planning for my future. The idea that he would spend my entire inheritance without discussing it with me, without warning me, without making alternate plans, didn't match the man who had raised me. I started keeping a journal, writing down everything I could remember about the last year of my father's life, trying to piece together when things had changed and how decisions had been made. Small details began to stand out. Conversations that had been cut short when I entered rooms, documents Diane had insisted on handling privately, phone calls she had taken in another room. 3 months into my new life, working 2 part-time jobs and living in a studio apartment with a broken air conditioner and paper-thin walls, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out the truth about my inheritance. What I discovered over the next few years would prove that sometimes the people who promise to take care of you are the ones you should trust the least. And sometimes revenge really is a dish best served cold. But that's a story for the next part of this journey. Make sure you're subscribed because what I found in those financial records will shock you, and how I used that information to get my revenge will show you that patience and planning can defeat even the most manipulative stepmother. 6 months after being kicked out, working double shifts at a diner and a grocery store, I finally saved enough money for something I had been planning. I hired a private investigator named Marcus, a former police detective who specialized in financial fraud cases. "Your stepmother's story has holes," Marcus said during our first meeting in his small office above a coffee shop. "Medical expenses don't typically drain entire trust funds that quickly, especially ones with the protections your father had in place." I showed him the few documents I had managed to keep from Dad's desk before Diane cleaned out his study. Bank statements from 2 years ago, insurance papers, and a handwritten note in my father's writing that said, "Emma's college fund, protected until 21." Marcus examined everything carefully. "This note suggests your father believed the money was secure. Either he was seriously confused about his finances near the end, or someone was managing information very carefully." Within 2 weeks, Marcus had discovered something that made my blood run cold. The reverse mortgage Diane claimed existed, it was taken out 3 months after my father's death, not before. She had used her position as executor to mortgage the house and pocket the money. "There's more," Marcus said, sliding a folder across his desk. Your stepmother has been transferring money from your father's business accounts into personal accounts she controls. Small amounts over time, but it adds up to nearly $200,000. The investment portfolio my father had been so proud of, still intact, but now listed under Diane's name as the sole beneficiary. She had somehow changed the beneficiary designations after his death. How is this legal? I asked, my hands shaking as I looked through the evidence. It's not, Marcus said grimly. This is fraud, forgery, and theft. Your stepmother has been systematically stealing your inheritance for months. I stared at the documents, proving that everything Diane had told me was a lie. My father hadn't spent my inheritance on medical bills. He hadn't left me with nothing. Diane had stolen everything and then kicked me out so I couldn't discover the truth. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment and cried for the first time since the funeral. Not just from grief, but from rage. This woman had looked me in the eye, called me family, and robbed me of everything my parents had worked to provide for me. But tears wouldn't get my money back. Planning would. I had learned something important during those 6 months in working multiple jobs and living on nothing. I was stronger than I had ever imagined, and now I had proof of what Diane had done. The question was how to use it. Marcus advised me to go straight to the police, but I had a different idea. She humiliated me, made me homeless, and stole my future, I told him. I want her to feel exactly what she put me through. Emma, revenge can backfire, Marcus warned. The legal route is safer. But I was 24 now, had been working and planning for 6 years. I wasn't the scared 18-year-old she had manipulated anymore. I wanted justice, but I also wanted her to experience the fear and desperation she had forced on me. My plan was simple but brilliant. I would become someone Diane needed, someone she would trust, and then I would destroy her the same way she destroyed me. I used my savings to enroll in business school, specializing in estate planning and financial management. While studying, I worked for a law firm that handled inheritance cases. I learned everything about trust funds, estate law, and financial fraud. I became an expert in the very systems Diane had used against me. After graduation, I started my own consulting business, helping families protect their assets. My reputation grew quickly because I understood how financial manipulation worked from both sides. Then I made my move. I contacted Ashley, now 26 and struggling financially, despite having access to my stolen inheritance. Through social media, I learned she was going through a messy divorce and needed help protecting her assets from her ex-husband. I approached her through a mutual acquaintance, introducing myself as Sarah Matthews, a financial consultant who specialized in protecting women's assets during divorce proceedings. Ashley had no idea who I really was. 10 years and professional styling had changed my appearance completely. My stepfather left me some money, but it's complicated, Ashley explained during our first meeting. My mother handles everything, but she's not great with legal stuff. Perfect. I offered to help Ashley understand her financial situation and protect her interests. This would require meeting with Diane to review the family's financial structure. Your mother sounds very smart to have managed everything so well after your stepfather's death, I said, playing to Ashley's ego. I'd love to meet her and learn how she preserved the family wealth during such a difficult time. Ashley beamed with pride. Mom is amazing. She had to make some really tough decisions, like cutting ties with my stepsister, who was just a financial burden. But Mom protected what was important. She had no idea she was talking to that financial burden. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in Diane's living room in my childhood home that she had stolen from me, listening to her explain how she had carefully managed my father's estate. The moment I had been waiting 10 years for had finally arrived. Diane looked older, but still carried herself with the same arrogant confidence that had intimidated me as a teenager. She wore expensive jewelry and designer clothes, clearly funded by my inheritance. "Sarah, thank you for helping Ashley," Diane said, offering me tea in my mother's china cups. "It's so important to protect family assets from outsiders who might take advantage." The irony was devastating. She was lecturing me about protecting assets from people like herself. "Tell me about your late husband's estate planning," I said, pulling out my legal notepad. "How did you manage to preserve everything for Ashley during such a difficult time?" Diane's eyes lit up with pride. She loved talking about how clever she had been. "Robert was wonderful, but not practical about money," she began, lying smoothly. "He wanted to leave everything to his daughter from his first marriage, but she was so young and irresponsible. I convinced him that the money should be used for medical care and that Ashley needed to be protected." I nodded sympathetically while recording every word. "That must have been difficult, convincing him to change his plans." "Oh, I didn't change anything," Diane said quickly. "I just managed the money more carefully after he passed. The stepdaughter was so demanding, expecting hand-downs for college and refusing to work. I had to make tough decisions about what was best for everyone." She was rewriting history, painting herself as the responsible guardian and me as a spoiled child. But she was also admitting to financial decisions she had made after my father's death. "What happened to the stepdaughter?" I asked innocently. "She moved out when she turned 18, Diane said with a dismissive wave. "Best thing for everyone. She was holding Ashley back, always bringing up her mother and making everyone uncomfortable. Some people can't accept new family structures." I bit my tongue to keep from screaming. This woman had stolen my inheritance, kicked me out of my home, and was now describing it as family improvement. "You must have significant assets to manage now," I said, steering the conversation towards specifics. "Properties, investments, trust funds?" "Robert left us very comfortable," Diane said proudly. "The house is paid off, and we have substantial investment accounts. Plus, Ashley will inherit everything someday, so we're planning carefully for her future." Everything she was describing was supposed to be mine. Over the next 3 months, I became Diane's trusted financial advisor. She showed me bank statements, investment portfolios, and legal documents, all while bragging about her financial management skills. I discovered the full scope of her theft. She had stolen not just my $400,000 trust fund, but also my father's life insurance policy, his business assets, and even my mother's jewelry collection that had been left specifically to me. The house she claimed was paid off still had the reverse mortgage she had secretly taken out. She was using the stolen money to make payments while telling Ashley they owned it free and clear. Most shocking of all, I found evidence that Diane had forged my father's signature on several documents, including a will amendment that changed beneficiaries and a power of attorney that gave her control over assets that should have been protected. "You're so smart, Sarah," Diane said during one of our meetings. "I wish Ashley was more interested in learning about money like you are." The compliment made me sick, but I smiled and played my part. I was gathering enough evidence to destroy her in court and expose every lie she had told. But I wanted more than just legal victory. I wanted her to experience the same shock and helplessness she had inflicted on me. I convinced Diane that Ashley needed a more sophisticated financial plan to protect her inheritance from her ex-husband. This required transferring assets into new accounts that I would help manage. The beauty of this structure, I explained to Diane, is that it protects everything Ashley inherited from your husband while keeping it in the family name. Diane was thrilled. She trusted me completely and began moving money according to my recommendations. What she didn't know was that every transfer created a clear paper trail documenting the stolen funds. The planning phase took 3 months of careful manipulation. I had to gain her complete trust while documenting every crime she had committed. Each meeting was strategically designed to get her to reveal more information while creating legal evidence for the future court case. I started by asking innocent questions about the timeline of my father's illness. It must have been so difficult managing everything when Robert got sick, I said sympathetically. How did you handle all the financial decisions? Oh, I had to take over everything, Diane said proudly. Robert was too emotional about money, especially when it came to Emma. He would have bankrupted us, paying for her college and whatever else she demanded. I nodded understandingly while my hidden recorder captured every word. You were protecting the family's financial future. Exactly, she continued. Emma never understood that money doesn't grow on trees. She expected to inherit everything without earning it. I had to make the hard choices about what was realistic. Over multiple meetings, I got her to describe in detail how she had managed the estate. She bragged about convincing my father to sign papers when he was heavily medicated, about making executive decisions after his death, and about protecting Ashley's interests by ensuring Emma couldn't waste the family money. Each revelation was more damning than the last. She admitted to changing beneficiary information, to taking out the reverse mortgage, to moving investment accounts into her name, and to destroying documents that proved my father's original intentions. I also convinced her to sign several financial documents, claiming they were standard protection papers. In reality, they were affidavits admitting to the unauthorized management of estate assets. You're protecting Ashley's future so well, I told Diane as she signed the papers. Your stepdaughter never would have understood financial planning like this. Emma was always selfish, Diane said, shaking her head. She expected everything handed to her without working for it. At least Ashley appreciates what she has. The irony was crushing. She was calling me selfish for expecting to inherit what my father had legally left me, while she had stolen everything for herself and Ashley. But the most important evidence came during our final planning session. I convinced Diane to show me my father's original will and the documents she had used to change his estate plans. I keep everything in the safe, she said, leading me to my father's old study. Robert was so disorganized, but I've kept perfect records. As she opened the safe, I saw documents I remembered from my childhood. My parents' marriage certificate, the deed to the house, insurance policies, and most importantly, my father's original will that clearly left everything to me. But there were also documents I had never seen before. Papers with my father's signature that looked different, shakier. Medical power of attorney forms dated during his final weeks when he was barely conscious. Beneficiary change forms for his life insurance and investment accounts. This power of attorney was so important, Diane said, showing me the document. It let me make decisions when Robert was too sick to understand what was happening. When exactly did he sign this? I asked, photographing the document with my phone while she wasn't looking. Just a few weeks before he passed, she said. He was on so much pain medication, but I explained how important it was to protect the family's future. That admission was the final piece I needed. My father had been under heavy sedation during his final weeks, legally incapable of making informed financial decisions. Any documents signed during that time could be challenged in court. That was the moment I decided it was time to reveal who I really was. The hardest part was watching Ashley discover that her entire life had been built on stolen money. When I revealed my identity to her, she initially refused to believe it. "You're lying," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Mom would never do that. Dad left us this money." I showed her the original will, the trust documents, and the proof of Diane's forgeries. Slowly, Ashley began to understand that everything she thought she knew about her family's finances was a lie. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Emma, I swear I didn't know she stole from you." I believed her. Ashley had been 17 when I was kicked out, and Diane had carefully controlled all information about the family finances. "What happens to me now?" Ashley asked. "If all this money is yours?" "The money in your personal accounts that you earned yourself is yours," I told her. "But everything that came from my father's estate has to be returned." Ashley nodded, looking devastated but resigned. "I understand. I'm sorry, Emma. I'm so sorry for everything." That conversation was painful but necessary. Ashley was a victim of Diane's lies too, just in a different way. The criminal trial was scheduled for 3 months after I filed charges. Those 3 months were a whirlwind of preparation, media attention, and emotional turmoil that I had not fully anticipated. Marcus helped me organize all the evidence we had collected into a comprehensive case file. We had recorded conversations, forged documents, financial records, and testimony from witnesses who could verify the timeline of events. But preparing for trial meant reliving every detail of my father's death and the trauma that followed. "You need to be ready for Diane's defense team," Marcus warned me during one of our preparation sessions. "They're going to try to paint you as a vindictive stepdaughter who couldn't accept your father's legitimate decisions. They'll claim the recordings were obtained illegally and that you manipulated Diane into making incriminating statements." I knew he was right. Diane had hired Robert Chen, one of the most expensive criminal defense attorneys in the state. Chen was known for his aggressive tactics and his ability to create reasonable doubt even in cases with overwhelming evidence. The media attention was unexpected and intense. Local news stations picked up the story when the charges were filed, and it quickly gained traction on social media. The narrative of a teenage girl being cheated out of her inheritance and spending 10 years planning her revenge resonated with people who had experienced similar family betrayals. "Stepdaughter's decade-long revenge plot leads to criminal charges," read one headline. "Financial fraud or family dispute, the case that's dividing social media," read another. I gave only one interview to a local reporter who had covered financial fraud cases before. I wanted to control the narrative and ensure that people understood this was about documented crimes, not family drama. "This isn't about revenge," I told the reporter. "This is about justice. My stepmother committed fraud, forgery, and theft. She stole hundreds of thousands of dollars that my father intended for me to inherit. The fact that she's family doesn't make those crimes less serious." Ashley struggled with the media attention more than I did. Reporters contacted her constantly, wanting statements about her mother and her own role in the family finances. She eventually hired her own attorney and issued a statement saying she had been unaware of her mother's crimes and would cooperate fully with the investigation. "I feel like everyone is watching me," she told me during one of our coffee meetings. "At work, people whisper when I walk by. My neighbors avoid me. Everyone wants to know if I knew what Mom was doing." I felt sorry for her. Ashley was genuinely innocent in all this, but she was suffering consequences for Diane's actions. She had lost her mother to prison, her financial security to restitution payments, and her reputation to public scrutiny. The preliminary hearings were difficult but encouraging. Judge Harrison reviewed the evidence and determined that there was sufficient probable cause to proceed with the criminal trial. Diane's attorney tried to get the recorded conversations thrown out, claiming they were obtained through deception, but the judge ruled that since I had identified myself honestly as a financial consultant and Diane had voluntarily shared information, the recordings were admissible. Mrs. Spencer entered into a business relationship with the complainant under false pretenses, Judge Harrison noted. However, the complainant did not misrepresent her professional qualifications or intentions to gather information for legitimate business purposes. The fact that Mrs. Spencer was unaware of the complainant's personal identity does not invalidate the voluntary nature of her statements. As the trial date approached, I found myself experiencing anxiety I had not felt since those first months after being kicked out of my home. I was sleeping poorly, having nightmares about the courtroom, and constantly second-guessing whether I had made the right decision to pursue criminal charges. My therapist, Dr. Sarah Kim, helped me process these feelings. You're about to face the person who traumatized you in a very public, high-stakes environment, she explained. It's natural to feel anxious, but remember, you're not the same vulnerable 18-year-old she manipulated. You're a successful adult with evidence, allies, and legal representation. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in late September. The courthouse was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and my small group of supporters, including Marcus, Ashley, and several colleagues from my business. Diane arrived with her legal team, looking composed and professional. She wore a conservative navy blue suit and had her hair pulled back in a style that suggested respectability and innocence. It was clearly a calculated choice designed to make her appear sympathetic to the jury. Judge Harrison called the court to order and explained the charges to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you will hear evidence about allegations of fraud, forgery, and theft involving estate assets. Your job is to determine whether the prosecution has proven these charges beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael Torres, laid out the case methodically. They started with the timeline of my father's death and the terms of his original will, establishing that I was supposed to inherit the majority of his estate when I turned 21. Robert Parker was a careful man who planned extensively for his daughter's future. He created a trust fund, maintained life insurance policies, and accumulated investment assets specifically to provide for Emma after his death. The defendant, as his widow and the executor of his estate, had a legal obligation to protect those assets for their intended beneficiary. Torres then presented evidence of how Diane had systematically stolen from the estate. Bank records showed money being transferred from accounts that should have been protected into accounts under Diane's control. Insurance claims showed policies being cashed out and proceeds deposited into personal accounts. Investment statements showed beneficiary changes made after my father's death. This was not a case of financial mismanagement or honest mistakes. This was a deliberate, calculated scheme to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from a grieving teenager. The most damaging evidence came from the recorded conversations I made while posing as Sarah Matthews. The jury listened to Diane describing how she had manipulated my father during his illness, how she had made financial decisions without his informed consent, and how she had deliberately kept me from discovering the truth about my inheritance. Listen to her own words, Torres said as he played one particularly incriminating recording. She admits to changing estate documents, to moving money that didn't belong to her, and to kicking me out of my childhood home to prevent me from learning about these crimes. When it was time for cross-examination, Diane's attorney, Robert Chen, tried to paint me as a manipulative person who had deceived his client. Ms. Parker created an elaborate false identity to trick my client into revealing private family information, he argued.
She recorded conversations without consent and used deception to gain access to confidential documents. But Torres was ready for this line of attack. Miss Parker used the same investigative techniques that law enforcement and private investigators use every day. She didn't break into anyone's home or hack into computer systems. She presented herself as a financial consultant, which she legitimately was, and Mrs. Spencer voluntarily chose to share information and documents.
Chen also tried to argue that my father had legitimately changed his estate plans during his illness. Robert Parker was a competent adult who had every right to modify his will and use his assets for medical care, he told the jury. The fact that his daughter disagrees with those decisions doesn't make them criminal. But the evidence contradicted this narrative. Medical records showed that my father had been heavily sedated and often unconscious during the time period when the crucial documents were allegedly signed. Handwriting experts testified that several signatures were forgeries. The timeline of financial transactions showed that most of the asset transfers had occurred after my father's death, not during his illness. Diane testified in her own defense, and it was painful to watch. She stuck to her story that everything she had done was to protect the family's financial interests and that my father had approved all the major decisions before his death. Robert was worried about Emma's maturity, she told the jury. He thought she was too young to handle a large inheritance responsibly. He asked me to manage the money until she was older and more established. But under cross-examination, her story fell apart. Torres confronted her with the recorded conversations where she had admitted to making decisions without my father's knowledge. He showed her forged documents with signatures that experts had determined were not authentic. He presented bank records that contradicted her timeline of when financial decisions were made. Mrs. Spencer, you testified that your husband approved transferring his life insurance proceeds to your personal account, Torres said. But this insurance claim was filed 3 months after his death. How could he have approved a decision that was made after he died? Diane's composure cracked. He had talked about it before. He wanted me to be financially secure. Where's the documentation of this conversation? Torres pressed. Where's the written authorization? Where is any evidence that Robert Parker intended for you to receive money that his will specifically left to his daughter? She had no answers that held up to scrutiny. The evidence was overwhelming, and her own recorded admissions had sealed her fate. Ashley's testimony was brief but important. She confirmed that she had been unaware of the financial crimes and that she had believed her mother's explanations about the inheritance. Her obvious distress and genuine remorse help establish that this was not a family conspiracy, but the actions of one person. I trusted my mother completely, Ashley said, tears streaming down her face. I never questioned where the money was coming from or whether Emma had been treated fairly. I should have, but I was young and I believed everything Mom told me. My own testimony was the culmination of 10 years of preparation. I sat in the witness chair and told my story clearly and calmly, from the night my father died to the moment I revealed my identity to Diane 6 months earlier. I spent 10 years wondering if my father had really abandoned me financially. I blamed myself for not being good enough, not being worthy of the inheritance he had promised me. Learning that he had never betrayed me, that Diane had stolen everything and lied to cover it up, was both a relief and a devastation. Chen tried to attack my credibility during cross-examination, focusing on the deception I had used to gather evidence. Miss Parker, you lied about your identity for 6 months. You recorded conversations without consent. You manipulated my client to trust you. How can this jury believe anything you say? I was ready for this question. I used the only method available to me to uncover the truth about crimes that had been carefully hidden for 10 years. Every recording I made captured your client voluntarily describing illegal actions she had taken. Every document she showed me was evidence of fraud she had committed. I didn't force her to steal from me. I just proved that she had. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours.
When they returned with their verdict, I felt my heart racing as Judge Harrison read the results. On the charge of fraud in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of forgery in the second degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of grand theft, we find the defendant guilty. I closed my eyes and let the relief wash over me. Justice had been served. Judge Harrison scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, giving both sides time to prepare impact statements and sentencing recommendations. During those 2 weeks, I wrote a victim impact statement that took me several days to complete. At the sentencing hearing, I stood before the court and read my statement aloud. Diane Spencer didn't just steal money from me. She stole my faith in family, my trust in the people who are supposed to protect me, and my belief that justice exists in the world. She took a grieving teenager and made her homeless and desperate. She forced me to question whether my father had ever really loved me. I paused, looking directly at Diane for the first time during the trial. But she also underestimated me. She thought that by making me powerless as a teenager, she could keep me powerless forever. She was wrong. Judge Harrison reviewed the evidence and impact statements before delivering his sentence. Mrs. Spencer, this is one of the most calculated cases of family fraud I have seen in 20 years on the bench. You exploited your position as executor to steal from someone who trusted you. You manipulated a grieving teenager and made her question her father's love. You showed no remorse for your actions and continued to lie even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. Diane was sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud and forgery. The civil judgment awarded me $850,000, including the original inheritance plus interest and punitive damages. But the real victory came when the judge ordered the immediate return of my childhood home and all assets that had been stolen. Miss Parker, Judge Harrison said, looking directly at me, the court commends your patience and thoroughness in documenting these crimes. Justice delayed is not always justice denied. As Diane was led away in handcuffs, she looked back at me with pure hatred. You destroyed my family. No, I replied calmly. I saved it.
6 months later, I was back in my childhood home, now legally mine. I had renovated it completely, erasing the changes Diane had made and restoring my mother's memory to every room. The restoration process had been deeply emotional and healing. In my parents' bedroom, I hung the wedding photo that Diane had hidden away for 10 years. In the living room, I displayed my mother's book collection and the family photos that had been removed when Diane moved in. The kitchen got new cabinets, but I kept my mother's favorite blue tiles that Diane had planned to replace. Most meaningful of all, I converted Diane's master bathroom back into the art studio my mother had used before she died. I found her easel and paint supplies in the basement, carefully preserved under dust covers, as if they had been waiting for me to return. Ashley and I slowly rebuilt our relationship. She got a job at a local marketing firm, moved into her own apartment, and started therapy to process the lies she had been told her entire adult life. I should have questioned things more, she told me during one of our weekly coffee meetings. When you left so suddenly, when Mom's stories about the money never quite made sense, when she would get defensive if I asked too many questions about Dad's will. You were a kid, I reminded her. Diane manipulated both of us. The difference is she stole from me and lied to you. Ashley had been devastated to learn that her college tuition, her car, even her wedding had been paid for with money stolen from me. She insisted on working out a payment plan to reimburse me, even though I told her it wasn't necessary. It is necessary, she said firmly. I can't build my life on money that was taken from you. It doesn't matter that I didn't know. I still benefited from it, and that's not right. Her determination to make things right showed me who Ashley really was underneath the spoiled behavior Diane had encouraged. She was working hard to become financially independent and emotionally healthy, attending therapy twice a week and taking business classes at night. My business thrived as word spread about my success in recovering stolen assets. I specialize in helping families who had been victimized by financial manipulation, using my experience to spot the warning signs Diane had used against me. My first major case after my own was helping a widow whose son had convinced her to sign over her house for tax purposes. Using the same investigative techniques Marcus had taught me, I uncovered a pattern of financial abuse and helped recover her property before she became homeless. "You saved my life," she told me, tears in her eyes as we left the courthouse after winning her case. "How can I ever thank you?" I told her, "Help someone else who needs it. That's how we break the cycle." Word of my work spread through referrals and media coverage. I was featured in several articles about financial fraud prevention and appeared on local news programs to discuss warning signs of estate manipulation. My expertise came from lived experience, which made my advice practical and trustworthy. Within 2 years of the court victory, my consulting firm had grown to employ 5 people, including a former police detective, a forensic accountant, and a family law attorney. We handled cases across 3 states and had recovered over $10 million in stolen assets for families. The work was deeply satisfying because I understood exactly how it felt to be victimized by someone you trusted. Every family I helped validated my own experience and proved that my suffering had served a purpose. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was knowing that Diane would spend the next 5 years thinking about how a scared 18-year-old girl had grown up to be her downfall. I visited her in prison exactly once, 6 months into her sentence. She looked older, smaller, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and institutional setting. The confident, manipulative woman who controlled my life was gone, replaced by someone who looked tired and defeated. "Why did you come here?" she asked, her voice hollow. "I came to see if I felt sorry for you," I answered honestly. "I wanted to know if getting justice would make me feel guilty or sad." "And do you?" she pressed. "No," I said simply. "I feel nothing. You made choices that hurt people, and now you're facing the consequences. That's not tragedy, that's justice." She looked down at her hands. "I never meant for things to go so far." "Yes, you did," I corrected her. "Every lie was a choice. Every forged signature was a choice. Every time you looked me in the eye and called me family while stealing from me was a choice. You meant all of it." That was the last time I saw her. I had no desire for ongoing contact or reconciliation. Some relationships, once broken by betrayal, are not worth repairing. The little girl who had been kicked out with nothing had become a successful woman who owned 2 properties, ran a thriving business, and had more money than her father had ever dreamed of leaving her. More importantly, I have learned that resilience isn't about avoiding hardship. It's about refusing to let hardship define your future. Diane had tried to destroy me, but instead, she had forged me into someone stronger than I ever would have been without that challenge. Sometimes revenge really is a dish best served cold, and sometimes justice takes 10 years to arrive, but when it does, it's absolutely perfect. The scared 18-year-old who once sat in a cheap motel, wondering how she would survive, had become a woman who helped other people reclaim their lives from financial predators. That transformation was worth more than any inheritance could ever have been. I kept one photo from the court proceedings on my desk at work. It showed Diane in handcuffs being led away after sentencing, her face a mask of disbelief and defeat. Not because I enjoyed her suffering, but because it reminded me that perseverance and truth eventually triumph over manipulation and greed. Some stories end with forgiveness and reconciliation. This one ended with justice and the knowledge that I had protected other families from experiencing what Diane had put me through. That felt like the right kind of ending.
What's your experience with family members who betrayed your trust? Have you ever had to fight for what was rightfully yours? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about getting justice when family fails you.